The trial continues of tennis star Rodney Maitland for criminal libel. The court has heard how he was found in a hotel bathroom with both wrists slashed. Nearby there was an apparent suicide note addressed to Dr. Holt Matthews, father of the girl who had been expecting Roddy's child. The note, which was opened by the police, contained accusations that the doctor had performed an illegal abortion on his daughter. Yesterday, Mrs. Holt Matthews, the doctor's wife, gave evidence that Roddy had telephoned her that evening and told her that her husband was a murderer. Roddy denies saying this and maintains that Mrs. Holt Matthews was drunk when he spoke to her. Later, the jury will decide whether Roddy was justified in calling Dr. Holt Matthews an abortionist and murderer. He's in the witness box now, being examined by Mr. James Elliott, QC.
I decided to stay in Fulchester and go back to the house the next day. You see, I couldn't understand it. It seemed incredible that Gail should have allowed him to perform an abortion. There had to be other reasons. I mean, other doctors. I was sure that he'd, well, murdered it. That's how it seemed to me.
And that was the construction you put on the doctor's words?
Yes.
Now, did the doctor say anything about an act of God?
No.
Where did you spend the night?
I spent at the Merton Lodge Hotel. I'd stayed there once or twice before. I knew the proprietress, Mrs. Hooper.
What time did you get there?
I don't know exactly, between 11 and midnight, I should think.
What did you do when you arrived?
I went straight up to my room. I'd had a hell of a day, what with one thing and another. First the disastrous match, then a couple of hours' drive, and on top of that finding out about Gail and the baby. I started to run a bath. I felt that a bath would help me sleep. Then I rang the desk. I was going to ask them for a bottle of whiskey, but when the night porter answered, I found myself asking for the number of the Holt Matthews' house.
Who did you speak
to? To Mrs. Holt Matthews. I asked her if I could speak to Gail, but she said that she wouldn't let me. I couldn't understand a lot of what she was saying. She sounded drunk.
Mr. Maitland, did you make any threats against her husband?
No, certainly not. Did
you threaten to prevent him practicing as a doctor?
No.
Did you describe him as a murderer?
Look, I hardly said anything. She was rambling on, and I thought there was no point in carrying on with the conversation.
And during this, your bath was running?
Right.
So the conversation was a fairly brief one?
Yes, all that was said was, I asked her if I could speak to Gail, and she said no.
After this telephone call, what happened next?
I sat down and wrote a letter.
To whom?
I wrote to Dr. Holt Matthews, accusing him of murdering our child.
Mr. Maitland, when you wrote that letter to Dr. Holt Matthews, was it your intention that anyone else should see it?
No. And no one else would have, if the police hadn't come in and taken it away. Why couldn't they mind their own damn business?
Mr. Maitland, is there any possibility of you resuming your career as a tennis player of world championship class?
What with these?
There's a permanent disability?
Yes, in the right hand, the tendon.
And your partnership in the sports goods shop?
The shop's being sold because my partner doesn't seem to think that my name means anything anymore.
Thank you.
Mr. Maitland, as far as the premature end to your very brilliant career as a sportsman is concerned, I'm sure you have the sympathy of the court.
Thank you.
It must have been a terrible and tragic moment for you when you thought that you'd thrown away all your opportunities.
It was my own fault, I realized that.
Well, that probably made it all the harder for you.
Yes.
So with this bleak future before you, you thought that you'd prefer to take your life?
There seemed to be no alternative.
This decision was taken purely on the grounds that you'd failed in your career. It was nothing to do with your relationship with Gail Holt Matthews.
It was all mixed together. Everything was such a mess. I could see no future.
But you're only 25 now, aren't you? It must be very disagreeable, once one has tasted the fruits of success and public adulation, to settle down to a more humdrum sort of life. But it's not impossible, is it?
I don't really know. But it looks as though I'm going to have to find out.
Because you did not succeed in your attempt to kill yourself.
Yes, that's correct.
Are you sure you really wanted to? It's almost a commonplace, isn't it, that some people pretend to be about to commit suicide in order to draw attention to themselves.
Look, I cut my wrist.
Oh, yes, you cut your wrist, but you must have realized that in such a small hotel there was a very good chance that you'd been discovered.
Then the whole thing would have been pointless,
You must have
wouldn't
also realized that the management, once they found you in the bath, would have been bound to call the police.
I suppose so. I wasn't thinking about it.
Well, think about it now, Mr. Maitland. The police would be called, wouldn't they?
Yes.
And when they found you in the bath with your wrists cut and possibly about to die, they'd be bound to take away any evidence they found in the bedroom, a possible suicide note, for
I don't
example.
see why. It wasn't addressed to them.
Nevertheless, you hoped that the police would open it first.
Why should I?
You just accused Dr. Holt Matthews of carrying out an illegal operation on his daughter. Now, what was your purpose in making those allegations?
Because I thought he should be exposed. I didn't think that he should be allowed to get away with it.
You admit that you wanted to expose him. Therefore, although you addressed the letter to him, you hoped that somebody else would read it first.
I wasn't thinking clearly. I just wanted to tell him what I thought of him.
Was that all? Wasn't it also your intention to ruin his career?
I thought that he shouldn't be allowed to carry on as a doctor if he was capable of doing something like that.
That is assuming, of course, that your allegations against him were correct.
They were. He as good as told me.
He told you what, Mr. Maitland? That he performed an abortion on his own daughter?
Not in so many words. But when I asked him about the baby, he said that it had been disposed of. What else was I supposed to think?
He denies that he says that, Mr. Maitland.
He would.
We hear only your word against his. Moreover, on your own admission, you were in a highly excitable and nervous state. Is it not possible that you were mistaken?
No.
Well, even if you thought you heard him say those words, they're very slender evidence indeed, aren't they, to build this whole extraordinary story of a professional man putting his entire career in jeopardy.
He did it. I know he did it.
How do you know he did it, Mr. Maitland? What evidence have you got?
Look, if Gail had lost the baby through a miscarriage, why should she be carrying on like this? She's told you that she loved me. Why should she stop, refusing to see me, hiding herself away? What would be the point?
But even if an abortion had been carried out as you say it had, why should that make any difference?
Because she's feeling as guilty as hell about it. That's why.
Are you now suggesting that this alleged operation was carried out with Gail's consent?
I think that he told her afterwards. I think they're all in it together.
Mrs. Holt Matthews, too?
Why else should she tell all those lies about my threatening the doctor? It's perfectly obvious to me to see what happened. They got scared about what they'd done, and he bullied them into keeping their mouths shut. You can see the kind of man he is.
And what kind of man are you, Mr. Maitland?
What's that supposed to mean?
When things go badly for you, do you have an overwhelming compulsion to lash out?
Oh, very clever. Look, I've apologized for what happened at Wimbledon, and I'm ashamed of it. And God knows I've been punished enough for it.
I'm not only talking about what happened at Wimbledon, Mr. Maitland. I'm talking about what happened when you found that the young girl you'd seduced no longer wanted to have anything to do with you. You have an overwhelming compulsion to lash out and destroy someone. Almost anyone, in fact.
It wasn't anyone. It was the man that killed my child.
Mr. Elliot?
No further questions, my lord.
Very well. Officer, you will now take the defendant back to the dock.
That concludes the case for the defence, my lord.
Thank you, Mr. Elliot.
May it please your lordship. Members of the jury. Rodley Maitland is charged with maliciously publishing a defamatory libel on Dr. Holt Matthews. He has pleaded justification, which means that he maintains that what he wrote in the letter was true and that it was in the public interests that it should be published. Well, I don't think we need to spend much time in establishing publication. Publication in a case of criminal libel need consist of nothing more than disclosing the libelous material to the person it refers to. In this case, to Dr. Holt Matthews. Nor, I think, can there be much doubt as to the libelous character of the context. A libel, members of the jury, is a remark calculated to injure the reputation of someone by bringing him into hatred, ridicule, or contempt. And this letter perfectly fits the description because it accused Dr. Holt Matthews of carrying out an illegal operation. Now, as to the defense of justification, I think you must ask yourselves what grounds the accused had for making these allegations. You've seen him in the witness box. And I think you will have observed that he's a young man of uncertain temper, given to emotional outbursts when he finds himself at a disadvantage. You remember how he behaved at Wimbledon. It was on the same night that he went to the Holt Matthews house, where there was a conversation on the doorstep of which we have heard differing accounts. He asked about the baby, and Dr. Holt Matthews says that he replied, "That little matter has been settled by an act of God." Well, this was perhaps not the most tactful of replies, but certainly not as offensive as the remark given in evidence by the accused, that this little problem had been disposed of. But, members of the jury, even if the doctor had made such a careless remark, would it have given any grounds for supposing that an abortion had been carried out? What evidence, members of the jury, is there that an abortion had taken place? My learned friend was quite unable to extract any such evidence from either Mrs. Holt Matthews or her daughter, and the doctor denies it unequivocally. Now, you'll have noticed that Dr. Holt Matthews is not the most tactful of men. You might have considered him brusque and even offensive. But you must not let this blind you as to his integrity. He comes from an old-fashioned school, of which the principal tenet is uncompromising honesty. And you may be sure that he will invariably tell the truth, whatever suffering he might bring upon himself and others. Now, as to the question of malice, we've heard a good deal in this case about the so-called suicide attempt of the accused, and I suppose we shall never know now whether he really meant to kill himself or not. But I would like to remind you of the police inspector's evidence. He was summoned to the hotel because blood-stained water was flowing out from underneath the door of the locked bathroom. Now, the accused in his evidence said that he ran his bath before he wrote the letter. Before, members of the jury. Why then, after he had cut his wrists, was the bath still running? You may think it was because he wanted to draw attention to his so-called suicide attempt, because he wanted the alarm to be raised, and above all, members of the jury, because he wanted somebody else other than Dr. Holt Matthews to get to the letter first. Somebody who would be in a position to bring proceedings against the doctor. That would be a clear indication of malice, would it not? And in this connection, I would remind you, too, of the evidence of Mrs. Holt Matthews about the telephone call, in which the accused threatened to expose Dr. Holt Matthews and ruin him professionally. Now, Mrs. Holt Matthews was perfectly frank about saying that she'd had several drinks that evening. But I would remind you of the conviction with which she asserted, "There are some things you don't forget." Well, it's not for me, members of the jury, to speculate upon the motives of the accused in publishing this libel, but I would remind you that he'd just received a severe setback in his career as a tennis champion. And I submit that the news coming on top of this, that Gail Holt Matthews had lost her baby and no longer wanted anything to do with him, made him want to lash out and hurt the man who had turned her against him. We've all had such feelings. But the difference between ourselves and Rodney Maitland, members of the jury, is that we do not then sit down and proceed maliciously to smash another man's career.